On May 15, 1951, General Omar Bradley sat in a witness chair in the Senate Office Building in Washington, District of Columbia, watching senators prepare to ask him questions that could destroy the reputation of America's most decorated general. The general was Douglas MacArthur, 71 years old, Medal of Honor recipient, hero of 2 world wars. MacArthur wanted to expand the Korean War into mainland China. He wanted to bomb Chinese cities, blockade Chinese ports, and possibly use atomic weapons. President Harry Truman had fired him 34 days earlier for insubordination. The American public was furious. Millions believed MacArthur was right and Truman was wrong. MacArthur had testified before Congress from May 3rd to May 5th, completing 3 days of testimony. He'd argued his case for the entire duration. His words were brilliant, his logic persuasive, his passion undeniable. He said the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed with him. He said victory in the powers in Korea required attacking China. He said anything less was appeasement. He'd gotten standing ovations. Now it was Bradley's turn. Bradley was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in America. He had 43 years of service. He'd commanded more soldiers in combat than any American general except Eisenhower. He was known for being quiet, careful, methodical. Soldiers called him the GI general because he cared about ordinary troops. Officers respected him because he never sought glory. But Bradley had one fatal problem that put him in direct conflict with the most popular general in America. He believed MacArthur's plan would start World War III. Bradley knew the Soviet Union had atomic weapons. He knew American forces were stretched thin around the world. He knew Europe, not Asia, was where the Cold War would be won or lost. MacArthur's plan to expand the war in Korea would weaken America's position in Europe, alienate American allies, and potentially trigger a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. That assessment meant Bradley would have to do something almost unprecedented in American military history. He would have to publicly contradict a superior officer, a 5-star general, a living legend. And he would have to convince the American people that their hero was dangerously wrong. Bradley had spent the previous month preparing. He'd reviewed every classified intelligence report on Chinese and Soviet military capabilities. He'd consulted with the other Joint Chiefs, Air Force Chief of Staff Hoy Vandenberg, Army Chief of Staff J. Lawton Collins, and Chief of Naval Operations Forrest Sherman. All agreed with Bradley's assessment. So did Secretary of Defense George Marshall, another 5-star general who'd been Army Chief of Staff during World War II. They all believed MacArthur's strategy would be catastrophic, but saying so publicly would require revealing classified information about American military vulnerabilities, information that MacArthur's supporters would call defeatist. The hearings were supposed to be closed to the public, but censored transcripts were released daily to the press. Every word Bradley spoke would be in newspapers across America by evening. He would have to be precise, factual, and devastating. The human cost of MacArthur's miscalculation began during the Chinese intervention that began in late October 1950. MacArthur had pushed United Nations forces north to the Yalu River, despite warnings that China would enter the war if American troops approached the Chinese border. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai had sent warnings through India. The warnings were explicit. China would intervene if UN forces crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea. MacArthur dismissed the warnings as bluff. He told President Truman the Chinese wouldn't dare fight American forces.
He estimated there might be 100,000 Chinese troops in Manchuria, but said they wouldn't cross into Korea. If they did, he promised American air power would destroy them. MacArthur was wrong. On October 19, 1950, 260,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River in secret. They moved at night, hid during the day, traveled through mountain passes American reconnaissance aircraft couldn't monitor. By late October, Chinese forces had positioned themselves in the mountains of North Korea, waiting. On November 1st, Chinese troops attacked the U.S. 8th Cavalry Regiment near Unsan. Thousands of Chinese soldiers appeared from nowhere, surrounding American positions in a 3-pronged assault. The 8th Cavalry lost over 800 men, almost 1/3 of the regiment's strength, in the first 48 hours. American forces had no idea the Chinese were even there. Bradley had warned against pushing north. So had the other Joint Chiefs. In October, they'd sent MacArthur instructions to use only South Korean forces near the Chinese border, keeping American units farther south. MacArthur ignored the guidance. He committed American forces all the way to the Yalu. He scattered them across a wide front with extended supply lines. When China attacked, American units were isolated, vulnerable, exposed. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir began on November 27, 1950, when 120,000 Chinese troops from the 9th Army Group attacked X-Corps in northeastern North Korea. MacArthur had sent X-Corps northeast toward the Yalu, while the 8th Army moved northwest, splitting American forces into two separate commands with a mountain range between them. They couldn't support each other. They couldn't coordinate operations. The temperature dropped to negative 40 degrees Celsius. American Marines and soldiers fought a 17-day battle while conducting a fighting withdrawal to the port of Hungnam. Over 4,000 Americans were either killed, wounded, or went missing during the battle. Platoon leaders made split-second decisions in frozen mountain passes. Company commanders directed fire while frostbitten fingers could barely pull triggers. Battalion officers coordinated withdrawals under constant attack. After pushing UN forces out of North Korea in December, Chinese and North Korean forces launched their third offensive on New Year's Eve. They hit South Korean divisions hard, forcing another withdrawal. UN forces abandoned Seoul on January 4, 1951. It was the second time Seoul had fallen to communist forces. American units served as rearguard, covering the retreat. Mortar fire and small arms engagements killed dozens of soldiers during the withdrawal. By late January 1951, the consequences of MacArthur's strategic miscalculation were devastating. American battle deaths before Chinese intervention, from June to October 1950, had reached over 8,500. The Chinese attacks from November through January added thousands more casualties. Most died after MacArthur pushed forces north against military advice. Most died in withdrawals from positions that should never have been occupied. Most died fighting an enemy MacArthur said wouldn't intervene. The casualty reports came to Bradley's office daily. Names, ranks, units, circumstances of death. Each report represented a family that would receive a telegram. Each report represented a military judgment that had failed. And MacArthur's public statements kept demanding more aggressive action, more attacks on China, more expansion of the war. Bradley read every casualty report available to him. He understood the cost of MacArthur's miscalculation, and he knew MacArthur's new plan would multiply that cost many times over. The official doctrine said MacArthur was right. America didn't fight limited wars.
American military tradition was total war, unconditional victory. That's how America won World War I. That's how America won World War II. MacArthur represented that tradition perfectly. He'd graduated first in his class from West Point. He'd won the Medal of Honor in World War I. He'd commanded the Southwest Pacific in World War II, defeated Japan, and overseen the occupation. He was brilliant, bold, and successful. When MacArthur spoke about military strategy, people listened. His argument for expanding the war in Korea made intuitive sense to most Americans. He said China was vulnerable. He said Chinese military power was overrated. He said bombing Chinese bases in Manchuria would cut off supplies to communist forces in Korea. He said a naval blockade would strangle the Chinese economy. He said using Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan would open a second front. He said these measures would force China to withdraw from Korea without committing more American ground troops. The plan sounded logical. It sounded like victory. But Bradley knew it was strategically insane. The problem wasn't MacArthur's tactics. The problem was MacArthur's understanding of global strategy. MacArthur had spent the previous 5 years in Japan as supreme commander for the Allied powers. He'd become focused on Asia to the exclusion of everything else. He developed what Bradley privately called Asia-first thinking. He believed the future of American power depended on controlling the Pacific. He believed Asia was more important than Europe. He believed the Soviet Union wouldn't intervene if America attacked China. Bradley knew MacArthur was wrong on every point,
The Soviet Union had 175 divisions globally with the capability to expand to over 300 divisions with full mobilization. The United States had 12 divisions. Western European nations were just beginning to rearm after World War II. NATO had been founded only 2 years earlier. European allies were terrified the Korean War would pull American forces out of Europe, leaving them vulnerable to Soviet invasion. If America attacked China, the Soviet Union had a mutual defense treaty with China. Stalin could invoke that treaty and attack Western Europe. American forces couldn't defend both Asia and Europe simultaneously. Even if the Soviets didn't attack Europe, expanding the war in Asia would destroy the alliance system America had spent 5 years building. Britain, France, and other NATO allies were already unhappy about Korea. They'd agreed to support UN action only because the war was limited to the Korean peninsula. If America bombed China, those allies would withdraw support. Some might leave NATO entirely. The alliance would collapse. Bradley had tried explaining this to MacArthur. In January 1951, the Joint Chiefs had sent MacArthur detailed guidance about limiting the war. They'd explained the global strategic situation. They'd emphasized the importance of maintaining Allied support. MacArthur had acknowledged the messages, but continued advocating for expansion. In March, President Truman prepared a peace proposal offering to negotiate with China. MacArthur received advance notice with orders to make no public statements about negotiations. On March 24th, MacArthur held a press conference and issued his own ultimatum to China, threatening to expand military operations to Chinese coastal areas and interior bases. The ultimatum sabotaged Truman's peace initiative. It made America look belligerent to allies. It made Truman look weak to the American public. Worst of all, it demonstrated MacArthur wouldn't follow orders from his civilian superiors.
The official military doctrine said generals obeyed orders, but MacArthur had decided his strategic judgment was superior to the president's. He'd taken his case directly to the American public and Congress, bypassing the chain of command. That was insubordination. Clear, documented, undeniable insubordination, and it left Bradley with an affording impossible choice. On April 6, 1951, Bradley met with President Truman, Secretary of Defense Marshall, and Secretary of State Dean Acheson at the White House. They discussed MacArthur's March 24th press conference. Truman asked Bradley if the Joint Chiefs supported MacArthur's strategy. Bradley said no. None of them did. Truman asked if MacArthur should be relieved. Bradley said that was a political decision the president had to make, but from a military standpoint, MacArthur could no longer be trusted to follow orders. The other Joint Chiefs agreed. On April 9th, all 4 chiefs, Bradley, Collins, Sherman, and Vandenberg, formally recommended MacArthur's relief to Secretary Marshall. They cited MacArthur's repeated insubordination and his refusal to execute policy he disagreed with. On April 10, Truman made his decision. On April 11, at 1 o'clock in the morning, the White House announced MacArthur had been relieved of all commands. The announcement shocked America. MacArthur was a hero. Truman's approval rating was 26%. Millions of Americans thought Truman was a failed haberdasher who'd stumbled into the presidency. MacArthur was a military genius. The firing looked like political cowardice. MacArthur returned to America on April 17th. 7.5 million people lined the streets for his ticker tape parade in New York City. It was the largest crowd in the city's history. On April 19, MacArthur addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech lasted 34 minutes. He was interrupted by applause 30 times. He defended his strategy. He attacked the administration's policy of limited war. He said there was no substitute for victory. He quoted an old barracks ballad, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Senators wept. MacArthur's speech was broadcast on radio and television to 40 million Americans. Public opinion polls showed 70% supported MacArthur. Only 30% supported Truman. Congressional Republicans demanded hearings to investigate why Truman had fired America's greatest general. The Senate Armed Services Committee and Foreign Relations Committee scheduled joint hearings to begin May 3rd. Bradley would be the key witness. If he contradicted MacArthur, he risked being called a liar, a coward, or a political tool. If he supported MacArthur, he'd be betraying his own judgment and the security of the nation. Either way, his testimony would determine whether civilian control of the military survived this crisis. Bradley worked alone preparing his testimony.
He spent hours in his Pentagon office reviewing intelligence reports that couldn't be made public. Reports about Soviet military strength in East Europe, reports about Chinese military capabilities, reports about American vulnerabilities. The information was classified. Revealing it might compromise sources, but without revealing some of it, Bradley couldn't prove MacArthur was wrong. The reports painted a grim picture. The Soviet Union had 35 divisions positioned in the Far East near the Korean border. Soviet forces in Europe and globally totaled 175 divisions, expandable to over 300 with mobilization. Combined with satellite forces, the communist bloc could field far more divisions than America could counter. The Soviets had atomic weapons. American intelligence estimated they'd tested their first atomic bomb in August 1949 and were producing more.
If war expanded to China, the Soviets might intervene with atomic weapons. American forces were already stretched then. Air Force Chief Vandenberg told Bradley that Korea was using 80 to 85% of America's tactical air capacity. The strategic bombing force was committed to defending Europe. There was almost nothing left for a wider war in Asia. Army Chief Collins reported that American ground forces worldwide totaled 12 divisions. 8 were committed to Korea or Japan. 4 were in Europe or the United States. There were no reserves. If the Soviets attacked Europe, America couldn't defend it. Navy Chief Sherman added that MacArthur's proposed naval blockade of China would require ships America didn't have. The Navy was maintaining operations in Korean waters, Mediterranean waters, and Atlantic waters. A blockade of China's entire coast would require pulling ships from Europe or mothballing them, leaving European waters undefended. Every service chief reached the same conclusion. America couldn't fight a larger war in Asia without abandoning commitments elsewhere. And if America abandoned those commitments, the Soviets would exploit the opportunity. Bradley also reviewed political intelligence about America's allies. Britain's government had made clear they would not support military action against China. France was fighting communist insurgents in Indochina and needed American support. Other NATO allies were terrified of being drawn into World War III. If America attacked China, the alliance would fracture. Some allies might even negotiate separate peace agreements with the Soviet Union. The entire Western alliance system, built since 1945, would collapse. MacArthur's strategy ignored all of this. He focused only on Korea, only on Asia, only on defeating China. He dismissed global considerations as political interference with military operations. He truly believed his plan would work, but Bradley knew belief wasn't strategy. Hope wasn't a plan. And MacArthur's confidence had already gotten thousands of Americans killed. On the morning of May 15, 1951, Bradley entered the Senate hearing room. The room was packed with senators, staff, and reporters. MacArthur had testified here from May 3rd through May 5th to thunderous applause. Now Bradley would present the opposite view. He wore his uniform without decoration except rank insignia. He looked tired. He'd barely slept in weeks. The chairman, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, called the hearing to order. He asked Bradley to present the Joint Chiefs position on MacArthur's proposals. Bradley opened the folder containing his prepared testimony. His hands didn't shake. His voice was steady. He began by acknowledging MacArthur's service and ability. He said no one questioned MacArthur's courage or patriotism. But then Bradley said something no general had said publicly about MacArthur in 30 years. He said MacArthur's strategy was wrong. Bradley explained the global situation methodically. He described Soviet military strength in Europe and Asia in detail. He explained America's limited resources with precision. He detailed the importance of maintaining Allied support with specific examples. He emphasized that Europe, not Asia, was the critical theater. The Cold War would be won or lost based on whether Western Europe remained free. If America poured resources into an expanded Asian war, Europe would be vulnerable to Soviet invasion. Then Bradley addressed MacArthur's specific proposals one by one. Bombing Chinese bases in Manchuria would require American aircraft currently protecting Europe. It would provoke Chinese retaliation against American bases in Japan and South Korea. The Chinese Air Force had not attacked UN positions, ports, or bases in Japan.
If America bombed China, that restraint would end. Chinese bombers could strike Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama.
American air defenses in Japan were minimal. Civilian casualties could be enormous. MacArthur's plan risked turning the Korean conflict into a wider war that would engulf Japan. A naval blockade of China would require ships that were defending Atlantic sea lanes and Mediterranean waters. It would take months to implement effectively. It would be ineffective because China's economy wasn't dependent on maritime trade with the West. The Soviet Union supplied most of China's military equipment by rail through Manchuria. A naval blockade couldn't stop that. MacArthur's blockade proposal was militarily impractical and strategically meaningless. Using nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan would be militarily ineffective and strategically counterproductive. Bradley testified in detail about Chiang Kai-shek's forces. Their leadership was poor, their equipment was poor, their training was poor. They'd been defeated by communist forces in the Chinese Civil War despite massive American aid.
Between 1946 and 1949, America had given Chiang's nationalists over $2 billion in military assistance. It hadn't helped. Chiang's armies had collapsed, not from lack of weapons, but from poor leadership, corruption, and low morale. Bradley told the Senate confidentially that from a military point of view, Chiang was not in a position to rally the Chinese against the communists, even if his forces could be landed on the mainland. Most Chinese did not accept Chiang's leadership. Using nationalist forces would provide limited military benefit while creating enormous political complications and giving the Soviet Union justification to intervene directly. And expanding the war would not guarantee victory. China had millions of soldiers available. Their army had shown it could fight effectively in Korea despite American air superiority. Chinese forces had pushed UN troops back from the Yalu to south of Seoul. They'd done it without using their air force against UN ground troops, without bombing UN supply lines, without attacking UN bases in Japan. If America expanded the war to China, all those restraints would end. A wider war might force America to use atomic weapons, alienating every ally and turning world opinion against the United States. Then Bradley delivered the line that would define the entire debate. He said, "I'm under no illusion that our present strategy of using means short of total war to achieve our ends and oppose communism is a pose guarantee that a world war will not be thrust upon us. But a policy of patience and determination without provoking a world war while we improve our military power is one which we believe we must continue to follow. Under present circumstances, we have recommended against enlarging the war from Korea to also include Red China. Red China is not the powerful nation seeking to dominate the world. Frankly, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy would involve us in the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy." The words hung in the air. Wrong war, wrong place, wrong time, wrong enemy. Bradley had just told America that its greatest general was proposing catastrophic strategic error. Reporters in the gallery wrote frantically. Senators leaned forward. The room was absolutely silent. Bradley continued. He explained that the real enemy was the Soviet Union, not China. The real threat was to Europe, not Asia. The real objective was containing Soviet expansion, not conquering China. MacArthur's plan ignored all of that. It would weaken America where it mattered most to pursue victory where it mattered least. It was strategically bankrupt. Bradley's testimony lasted several hours. He answered every question with precision. He provided details on Soviet capabilities, American weaknesses, and strategic priorities. Much of his testimony had to be given in closed session because it was too sensitive for public release. Information about Soviet strength, American vulnerabilities, and Allied weaknesses couldn't be shared openly without compromising national security. But the core message was clear and devastating. MacArthur was wrong. The other service chiefs testified over the following days, providing additional evidence that contradicted MacArthur's claims. Air Force Chief Vandenberg revealed classified information that shocked even some senators. He testified that 85% of America's tactical air power was already committed to Korea. The strategic bomber force that would strike the Soviet Union in a general war was being used tactically in Korea. There was almost nothing left in reserve. If MacArthur's plan required bombing China extensively, America would have to pull aircraft from Europe, leaving NATO defenseless against Soviet attack. Vandenberg's testimony was initially deleted from public transcripts because it revealed how vulnerable America actually was.
The information wasn't declassified until the 1970s. When Americans finally read it decades later, they understood how close MacArthur had come to triggering a war America couldn't win. Army Chief Collins testified that MacArthur's claims about Chinese weakness were incorrect and dangerously misleading. The Chinese had not used their full military power in Korea. They had not used their air force against UN ground troops. They had not bombed UN ports in Busan or Incheon. They had not attacked UN bases in Japan, which were completely vulnerable to air attack. They had not bombed UN supply lines, which stretched hundreds of miles. If America attacked China, the Chinese would escalate in all these areas. The war MacArthur claimed he could win quickly would expand into a prolonged conflict across East Asia. Collins provided specific numbers. China could field millions of additional soldiers. The Soviet Union could provide unlimited equipment and ammunition through the rail lines from Siberia. America and its allies couldn't match that commitment in Asia while also defending Europe. Collins made clear that MacArthur's strategy would trap America in an unwinnable war of attrition in the wrong theater. Navy Chief Sherman testified that a naval blockade of China was logistically impossible with available forces and strategically meaningless, even if implemented. China's coast was over 4,000 miles long. A complete blockade would require hundreds of ships. America didn't have hundreds of ships available. The Mediterranean fleet couldn't be pulled away from containing the Soviet Union. The Atlantic fleet couldn't be pulled away from defending sea lanes. The Pacific Fleet was already supporting operations in Korea and protecting Japan. There were no additional ships available for a sustained blockade. Even if ships could be found, Sherman testified the blockade would be ineffective. China received most of its military supplies by rail from the Soviet Union. Naval ships couldn't blockade railroads. China's economy wasn't dependent on international maritime trade. Most Chinese lived in agricultural areas that were self-sufficient. A naval blockade would hurt Chinese imports and exports, but wouldn't dampen the Chinese military or force the government to negotiate. MacArthur's blockade proposal was based on World War II thinking. It wouldn't work against a continental power supplied by land from the Soviet Union. Secretary of Defense Marshall delivered the final blow to MacArthur's credibility. Marshall had been Army Chief of Staff during World War II. He'd planned the D-Day invasion. He'd coordinated the defeat of Germany and Japan. He'd created the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. He was the most respected strategic thinker in America. Marshall testified that MacArthur's repeated insubordination had made it impossible to trust him with command. This wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about whether military officers could be allowed to conduct independent foreign policy when they disagreed with the president. MacArthur had issued public statements contradicting administration policy. He'd sabotaged peace initiatives. He'd tried to rally Congress and the public against his civilian superiors. That was intolerable in a democracy. Military officers served at the pleasure of the president. They obeyed orders or resigned. They didn't conduct independent foreign policy through press conferences and congressional letters. Marshall pointed out that if the president couldn't control his field commanders, the entire command structure would collapse. Every general would feel entitled to make policy if they disagreed with Washington. The result would be chaos. American foreign policy would become whatever the most popular general wanted it to be. That wasn't how democracies worked. That was how military dictatorships started. Marshall's testimony was devastating because Marshall was beyond reproach.
He'd served under both Democratic and Republican presidents. He'd been trusted by Roosevelt, Truman, and even many Republicans. He had no political agenda. When Marshall said MacArthur was wrong and had to be relieved, people believed him. The combination of Bradley, the Joint Chiefs, and Marshall systematically dismantled every part of MacArthur's case. MacArthur had claimed the Joint Chiefs agreed with him. They testified under oath that they didn't. MacArthur had claimed his strategy would win quickly. They testified it would likely start World War II. MacArthur had claimed China was weak.
They testified China had barely begun to use its full power. MacArthur had claimed Soviet Union wouldn't intervene. They testified Soviet intervention was probable if America attacked China. The hearings lasted 7 weeks. Over 2 million words of testimony were recorded and transcribed. The American public slowly began to understand what Bradley had been saying from the beginning. MacArthur's plans sounded good in speeches and sounded logical in theory, but the military professionals who had to implement it, who understood global strategy and had access to classified intelligence, said it would fail catastrophically. They said it with specificity, with evidence, with detailed analysis. Bradley's phrase, "the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy," became the defining statement of the entire crisis. Newspapers repeated it daily. Commentators analyzed it from every angle. Radio broadcasters discussed what it meant. The phrase captured perfectly what Bradley was arguing. America was fighting a limited war in Korea to contain communist expansion. That was the right strategy for the nuclear age. Expanding to China would be fighting the wrong war because it would be a war of choice, not necessity. Fighting in mainland Asia would be the wrong place because it was the worst possible terrain for American advantages in mobility and firepower. Fighting when American forces were unprepared and allies were opposed would be the wrong time, because America needed years to build up military strength, and China was the wrong enemy because the real threat was the Soviet Union in Europe. MacArthur wanted to fight a war America couldn't win in a place that didn't matter against an enemy that wasn't the main threat. Bradley had explained why that was strategic insanity. By mid-June, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Polls showed support for Truman's decision rising week by week. Support for MacArthur's strategy was falling. Correspondingly, Americans were starting to understand that limited war was a new and necessary concept required by the existence of nuclear weapons. Total war in the atomic age meant total destruction, possibly the end of civilization. Limited war preserved American power while containing communist expansion without risking nuclear holocaust. It was frustrating. It felt unsatisfying compared to World War II's unconditional victory over Germany and Japan. American soldiers were dying for a tie, not a victory. That was hard to accept emotionally, but it was strategically sound. And Bradley had explained why with such clarity and authority that even MacArthur's strongest supporters in Congress began to waver. The hearings ended June 27, 1951. The Senate committees issued a joint report concluding that Truman's firing of MacArthur was within the constitutional powers of the president and appropriate under the circumstances. They found that MacArthur's strategy was not supported by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They found that MacArthur had repeatedly violated orders by making public statements on policy matters without authorization.
They recommended that future military operations of significant scope require explicit congressional approval to prevent similar conflicts between military and civilian authority. The report was carefully worded to avoid directly criticizing MacArthur while supporting Truman's decision. It was a political compromise that nonetheless affirmed civilian control of the military. Bradley never received public recognition for his testimony. There was no medal, no commendation, no parade. He'd done what needed to be done, contradicted a superior officer to prevent strategic disaster, and then gone back to work. The official record credited Truman's political courage and Marshall's strategic wisdom. Bradley's name appeared in the footnotes, but military professionals understood what had happened. Bradley had saved civilian control of the military. He'd prevented World War III, and he'd established the principle that strategic wisdom mattered more than tactical brilliance or personal popularity. MacArthur faded from public life after the hearings. He never received another military command. He gave speeches at Republican conventions. He wrote his memoirs. He was discussed briefly as a potential presidential candidate in 1952, but his political support evaporated once the full testimony from the hearings became public. Americans realized his strategy had been dangerously wrong. By early 1952, MacArthur was just another retired general living at the Waldorf History Hotel in New York. He would live there for the next 12 years, gradually fading from public consciousness. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower won the presidency partly by promising to go to Korea and end the war. Eisenhower had been Bradley's partnings, a colleague during World War II. He'd commanded Allied forces in Europe while Bradley commanded ground forces. They shared similar strategic views about the need for Allied unity and the primacy of Europe in American strategy. Eisenhower understood limited war and global strategy in ways MacArthur never had. When Eisenhower took office in January 1953, he maintained Truman's policy of limited war in Korea. He didn't expand the conflict into China. He didn't bomb Manorian bases. He didn't use nationalist Chinese forces. He didn't impose a naval blockade. Instead, he quietly threatened to use nuclear weapons if negotiations didn't produce an armistice, a threat that may have helped push the Chinese toward agreement. He negotiated an armistice that ended the fighting on July 27, 1953. The armistice established a demilitarized zone roughly along the 38th parallel, essentially where the war had begun 3 years earlier. North Korea remained communist under Kim Il-sung. South Korea remained free under Syngman Rhee. Neither side won in any traditional sense. No territory changed hands permanently, no government fell, no unconditional surrender was signed. But World War III didn't start. NATO held together and actually grew stronger with the addition of Greece and Turkey. The Soviet Union didn't invade Western Europe. The Western alliance system survived intact. The American commitment to defending Europe was strengthened, not weakened. Thousands of American soldiers had died in Korea. Nearly 37,000 Americans were killed in action during the 3 years of fighting. Another 100,000 were wounded. Thousands remained missing, but millions didn't die in a wider war that could have gone nuclear. The world didn't experience atomic warfare for the second time in history. That was the victory Bradley had fought for. Not glory, not conquest, not dramatic success, just preventing catastrophe. Bradley continued as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff until August 16, 1953, serving the full term Truman had appointed him to in 1949. He retired after 41 years of military service, having entered West Point in 1911 and served through 2 world wars and Korea. He returned to civilian life quietly, without fanfare. He wrote his memoirs, which were published as The Soldier's Story.
He worked as chairman of the board for the Bulova Watch Company from 1958 to 1973. He served on corporate boards and gave occasional speeches at military academies. He spoke rarely about the MacArthur controversy, preferring to let the historical record speak for itself. He avoided publicity and lived a private life with his wife Mary until her death from leukemia in 1965. In 1981, Bradley gave one of his final interviews to a military historian who was researching the MacArthur hearings. Bradley was 88 years old by then, but still sharp mentally. The historian asked him about the decision to testify against MacArthur 30 years earlier. Bradley thought carefully before answering. He said the decision to testify against MacArthur was the hardest thing he'd done in his entire military career, harder than any combat decision he'd made during World War II. Contradicting a superior officer, especially one as respected and decorated as MacArthur, violated everything he'd been taught about military loyalty at West Point and throughout his career. The military culture emphasized loyalty up the chain of command. You supported your superior officers, even when you disagreed with them privately. But Bradley said he'd come to understand that loyalty to the nation and the Constitution mattered more than personal loyalty to any individual officer. MacArthur's strategy would have destroyed the Western alliance system that America had spent 6 years building after World War II. It would have isolated America from its allies. It would very possibly have triggered nuclear war with the Soviet Union. The stakes were too high to remain silent out of personal loyalty. Someone had to stop MacArthur. Someone had to tell the American people and Congress that their hero was proposing a strategic disaster. Bradley said he never regretted his testimony, though it had cost him personally.
He'd received hate mail for years afterward from MacArthur supporters who saw him as a traitor. Some accused him of cowardice, others accused him of being a communist sympathizer. The attacks hurt, but he knew he'd done the right thing. He said the principle of civilian control of the military was fundamental to American democracy and had to be preserved regardless of personal cost. Military officers advise the President and Congress on military matters. They provide their professional judgment, but civilians make the final decisions about war and peace. Officers who can't follow civilian decisions must resign their commissions. They can't conduct their own foreign policy through press conferences and public statements. That principle had been tested severely in 1951. It had survived because enough senior officers, Bradley, Marshall, Collins, Sherman, and Vandenberg, chose to put country above personal loyalty to a fellow officer. The historian asked if Bradley thought MacArthur ever understood why he'd been wrong. Bradley paused for a long moment before answering. He chose his words carefully. He said MacArthur was a brilliant tactical commander and a genuinely talented military leader at the operational level. MacArthur's landing in Incheon had been audacious and successful. His island-hopping campaign in the Pacific during World War II had been innovative. But MacArthur was a terrible strategic thinker who couldn't see beyond the immediate theater he was operating in. He saw the world through a narrow lens focused exclusively on military ends and victory in his area of responsibility. He didn't understand alliance politics or how they constrained military options. He didn't understand global strategy or how actions in one theater affected other theaters. He didn't understand nuclear weapons and how they fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. He believed the lessons of World War II, total war ending in unconditional surrender, applied to every conflict. He was wrong. The world had changed.
Nuclear weapons made total war suicidal. Allies made unilateral action impossible. Limited war for limited objectives was the only rational strategy in the atomic age. MacArthur never grasped that. And when his strategic judgment was challenged by people who understood these things better than he did, he chose personal glory and vindication over national interest. Bradley said MacArthur's fundamental tragedy was that he couldn't accept being wrong. He couldn't admit that his understanding of the strategic situation was flawed. He couldn't defer to civilian authority on matters of grand strategy. His ego wouldn't allow it. So he'd forced a constitutional crisis that nearly destroyed the principle of civilian control of the military. And even after all the testimony, all the evidence, all the classified briefings that proved his strategy was unworkable, MacArthur never publicly admitted error. He spent the rest of his life believing he'd been right and that history would vindicate him. History didn't. Bradley reflected that some men were great in war, but couldn't adapt to the complexities of the nuclear age. MacArthur was one of them. He was a 19th century warrior trying to fight a 20th century conflict with 19th century methods. It couldn't work. Omar Nelson Bradley died on April 8, 1981, at age 88. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His gravestone listed his rank and service dates. It didn't mention the wrong war speech. It didn't mention stopping MacArthur. It didn't mention preventing World War II. His obituaries focused on his World War II service, the Normandy invasion, and the liberation of Europe. The MacArthur testimony was mentioned briefly as a footnote. Most Americans had forgotten it by 1981. But military historians understood Bradley's testimony in 1951. Changed American strategic culture. Before Bradley, most Americans believed military victory required total war. After Bradley, Americans understood limited war was sometimes necessary. Before Bradley, popular generals could challenge civilian authority by appealing to public opinion. After Bradley, that was considered insubordination. Before Bradley, strategy was whatever worked on the battlefield. After Bradley, strategy included alliance politics, nuclear weapons, and global priorities. Bradley didn't write the doctrine of limited war. Political scientists and strategists did that. But Bradley gave it legitimacy by being willing to contradict MacArthur publicly. He showed that professional military judgment could prevail over personal popularity
when the stakes were high enough. The Pentagon still has Bradley's testimony in its archives. Military officers study it at the War College. The key passage, "Wrong war, wrong place, wrong time, wrong enemy," is quoted in textbooks on civil-military relations and strategic studies. The phrase has been used by politicians, generals, and commentators to describe other strategic errors. During the Vietnam War, critics said America was fighting the wrong war. During the Iraq War, critics used Bradley's exact words. The phrase has outlived its original context and become shorthand for strategic error, but few people remember the man who said it. Bradley was the opposite of MacArthur in every way. MacArthur sought glory. Bradley avoided it. MacArthur made dramatic speeches. Bradley wrote careful reports. MacArthur wore elaborate uniforms with dime every decoration. Bradley wore simple uniforms with minimal insignia. MacArthur believed military genius transcended political constraints. Bradley believed military professionals served civilian authority. And when those two philosophies collided in 1951, Bradley's prevailed, not because he was more popular or more eloquent or more decorated, but because he was right.
That's how strategic wisdom actually works in democracies. Not through brilliant speeches or bold promises, but through careful analysis by professionals willing to tell civilians what they need to hear, even when it contradicts what they want to hear. Bradley saw that MacArthur's plan would fail. He explained why. He accepted the personal cost of opposing a hero, and he prevented disaster. No one built monuments to that. No one named aircraft carriers after him. No one made movies about his testimony. But America survived the Korean War without World War II starting. NATO stayed together. The Soviet Union didn't conquer Europe, and civilian control of the military remained intact. Bradley's testimony was a small moment in a closed hearing room, a 4-hour speech most Americans never read, a careful explanation of strategic realities that contradicted popular emotion. But that moment prevented one of the greatest strategic errors in American history, and it established principles that still govern American civil-military relations 70 years later. Military officers serve civilian authority. Strategic judgment considers global consequences, not just tactical victories. Popular opinion doesn't determine military strategy. And sometimes the hardest thing a soldier can do is tell his nation that its hero is wrong. Bradley did that, and America is still here because he did. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the 20th century. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from California to Cairo. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.